What in blazes was that sound?
Look there. I saw something move.
We best check it out.
The dogs were close. He could hear them before he could hear anything else. That low, wet sound moving through the dark like something alive and hungry, dragging itself across the ground. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that pressed against a man's chest and made breathing feel like work. He was belly flat in the shallow ditch alongside the eastern fence line, the one he had dug himself, the one whose every post he had sunk into the earth with his own hands, the one whose measurements he had memorized not because he was told to, but because he had decided months ago that knowing the size of a cage was the first step toward leaving it. He did not move. The footsteps of the patrol were maybe 40 yards north. The lantern swung in a slow arc. He watched the light drag across the tree line and thought about breathing. Slow, immeasured, through his nose, not his mouth. Sound carried differently at night. He had learned that. He had learned a great many things. He pressed his cheek into the wet grass and waited. Welcome to Unmarked History, the channel where the stories that were never meant to be told finally get told. If you are new here, subscribe right now, because what you are about to hear is not the kind of history they put in textbooks. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. We have listeners from Lagos to London, from Atlanta to Amsterdam. And every single one of you found this channel for a reason. Now, let us go back. Mississippi, 1853. The Callaway Plantation sat on 1,100 acres of Mississippi bottomland. It positioned in that particular bend of the county where the soil was so dark and so rich it looked almost purple after rain. The land was old in the way that land absorbs suffering and keeps it, silently, permanently, without apology. Cotton had been growing here since before most of the men who claimed to own it had been born, and the fields stretched in every direction with a kind of patient enormity that made a man feel small, not just physically, but cosmically. Like the land itself was a system, and the system had decided, long before you arrived, exactly what you were worth. The house stood on a slight elevation at the northern end of the property. It was not the grandest house in the county. Callaway himself was a practical man, not given to ostentation. But it was large, white-columned in the Greek revival manner, yet with deep verandas on both the front and back. From the rear veranda on a clear morning, a man standing at the right angle could see almost the full length of the eastern field, all the way down to the tree line where the property boundary ran alongside a creek called Mercy Branch, which was neither merciful nor particularly branch-like, but simply a narrow water corridor that flooded in spring and ran shallow the rest of the year. The quarters were a quarter-mile south of the main house. 12 low structures arranged in 2 rows, each one housing between 6 and 9 people, depending on the season and what the ledges required. The structures had been built years before any of the current inhabitants had arrived, and they showed it. Gaps in the boards sealed with mud and rags, roofs that sang in heavy rain, or dirt floors that turned to mud when water moved under the foundations. In summer, the heat inside them was of a particular quality. It was not just warm, it was weighted. It sat on the chest. It made sleep a kind of labor. Between the quarters and the main house were the work structures, the smokehouse, the corn crib, the tool shed, the cotton gin house, the 2 large barns, and, at the far southeastern edge of the compound, the well. There was only one well that worked reliably. That would become important. His name was Edmund. That was the name in the ledger. Edmund, male, approximately 28 years, sound constitution, skilled in carpentry and general labor, acquired Natchez, 1849. The ledger did not record what had come before Natchez. The ledger was not interested in before. The ledger was interested in what a body could produce, what a body cost to maintain, and what a body might be worth if transferred. But Edmund had a history that predated the ledger, and he carried it in the way that men carry certain things. Not loudly, not on the surface, but in the quality of his attention. He noticed things. He always had. As a child, in a place whose name he kept only inside himself, he had learned that the world communicated in patterns. The way a particular man walked when he was in a certain mood, the way the air changed before weather arrived, the way silence had different textures depending on what was happening inside it. His mother had called it a gift. The men who had bought and sold him had never noticed it at all. That was the gift's true utility. He was, by any observable measure, a model labourer. He arrived before he was required. He worked with a kind of quiet efficiency that supervisors found satisfying without being able to articulate exactly why. He never argued. He never appeared idle. He answered questions with precisely as many words as the question required. No more, no fewer. He was known among the other enslaved people as a man of few words and steady temperament, someone whose calm was reliable in the way that very few things on the plantation were reliable. What no one on that property understood, not Calloway, not the overseer, not the other workers who slept beside him and shared meals with him, was that the calm was not passivity. It was engineering. He had been at Calloway's plantation for 4 years when he first decided to leave. That is not quite accurate. He had wanted to leave since the moment he arrived. Since every moment before that, and stretching back as far back as his memory could reach. But wanting and deciding were different operations. Wanting was emotional. Deciding was architectural. And what happened in the spring of 1853 was that the emotion finally found its structure. He could not say later, even in his own mind, what the precise moment was. It was not a single event. It was more like a threshold, a place in the continuous accumulation of indignity and loss and controlled breath that, when crossed, reorganized everything, like water heating toward a boil. Not one flame, but the steady application of heat until the molecules cannot hold their arrangement any longer. What he could say was this. By March of 1853, he was watching. Not reacting, not enduring, watching. There is a difference. The overseer's name was Reuben Galt. He had come to Calloway's employ 2 years prior, transferred from a larger operation in Adams County under circumstances that no one fully explained and that Galt himself did not invite questions about. He was a lean man, somewhere in his middle 40s, with the kind of face that had once been handsome, in a sharp, angular way, and had since been weathered into something harder. He wore the same hat every day, a wide-brimmed felt affair that had been a dark brown when new and was now the colour of dried mud. And he had a habit, when thinking, of touching the brim with 2 fingers, just barely, like he was reminding himself it was there. Galt was not a man who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. This made him, in some ways, more dangerous than a man who did. A man who enjoyed cruelty became predictable in his enjoyment. You could map his escalations, anticipate his moods. Galt was motivated by something more austere. Order. He believed in systems. He believed that a well-run operation required consistent enforcement of consistent rules, and that sentiment, in any form, was a contamination of the system. He was not warm. He was not cold. He was calibrated. He had been watching Edmund for about 6 weeks. Edmund did not know this yet. That would become important too. Spring came to the bottomland with a slow, wet insistence. The air changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way seasons change in that part of the country, which is to say, through accumulation. One morning, the light was slightly different. One afternoon, the earth smelled differently after rain. The pecan trees along the western property line began their slow, cautious decision to show leaves, and the cotton fields, still bare and furrowed from the previous season's turn, waited. Edmund was assigned to the well-digging detail in the first week of April. Callaway had decided to sink 2 new wells, one near the far eastern field and one at the northern boundary of the property, closer to the creek crossing where the timber operation ran in the late autumn. This was practical planning on Callaway's part. The existing well was a long walk from both work sites, and in the deep summer, the time lost to water retrieval accumulated. 2 new wells would improve efficiency. Callaway told Galt this. Galt told Edmund. Edmund nodded and went to get the tools. What Edmund understood, standing at the lip of the first hole he would dig, and looking out across the geometry of fences and fields and structures that constituted the world he was imprisoned in, was that a man assigned to dig wells was a man with a reason to be everywhere. Think about what that means. A man assigned to dig wells has to survey the ground, has to walk the property, has to assess the soil at multiple locations, which means he stands at the eastern fence line and looks at what lies beyond it. He stands at the northern boundary and observes the tree cover, the distance to the creek, the angle of the slope. He asks, because he must ask, about the underground water table, which means he is given topographical information, where the land rises, where it sinks, where water moves. He is given a map. Not on paper, never on paper, but in explanation, in instruction, in the practical requirements of his work. Edmund listened to every word. The detail was 3 men. Edmund, a younger man named Cyrus, who had arrived the previous autumn and was still learning the cadence of the place, and an older man everyone called Preacher, though he had not preached in years and did not, as far as anyone could determine, intend to begin again. Preacher had worked this property for 11 years. He knew every inch of it. Edmund had been watching Preacher for as long as he had been watching anything else here. The first day of digging, they set up at the eastern location. Galt walked out with them in the morning, observed their technique for 20 minutes, then left to attend to other matters. Edmund watched Galt walk back toward the main structures, watched the direction, the pace, the timing. The Galt walked the eastern path at a particular speed when he was heading back for the morning account of tasks. That information joined other information already stored. The hole went down slowly. The top foot of earth was dark and yielding. Below that, the clay began, heavy, resistant, the colour of dried blood. Edmund worked the long-handled spade with a consistency that was mechanical in its precision, not because he was not tired, but because he had learned, years ago, that physical labour occupied a particular layer of consciousness, and that the other layers could operate independently. His hands dug, his mind mapped. He noted. The fence line here ran north-south, 8-foot intervals between posts, 3 rails high. The easternmost post was within 20 feet of a stand of young cottonwood trees that thickened, is over about 30 yards into a real wood. Through that wood, he had seen this from the road once, 2 years ago, on a supply detail, was a path. The path ran northeast. He did not know how far. He had not been able to observe long enough to determine its destination. He needed to know how far. Not yet. He dug. Cyrus worked beside him, breathing hard in the way of young men unaccustomed to this particular labour, the kind that does not allow rest. Cyrus was 20, maybe 21, and he still had the habit, not yet trained out of him, of talking while he worked. Not loudly, not indiscriminately, but in the way of a person who had grown up in a place where talking while working was normal and had not yet recalibrated. Edmund listened to him. Not because the conversation was strategic, because Cyrus was a human being and deserved to be heard, and because Edmund, whatever else he was in the architecture of this place, had not given up on the basic requirement of seeing people as people. But he also filed away what Cyrus said without appearing to file it. Cyrus had been brought from a plantation 3 counties east. He had a sister still there. He talked about her sometimes in the way that people talk about things they have accepted losing. Quietly, with a kind of practiced flatness that was not actually flat, that was, in fact, the opposite of flat, that was grief, with a surface coating of resignation. Edmund listened. He didn't know yet that Cyrus would matter to what came next. He didn't know yet that Cyrus, in the particular way of people who carry loss in their bodies, would become the one variable he had not accounted for. April moved forward. The first week of digging established the Eastern Wells location and depth requirements. Edmund spent 4 days in that hole, moving through clay and then through a sandy transition layer and then into the dark, cool stratum where water moved. He learned the depth. He also learned, standing in the base of that hole and looking up at the rectangle of sky above him, exactly what a man could see from ground level around the perimeter of the eastern section. Not much. That was useful. A low-lying section near the southeastern fence where the ground dipped slightly and the grass grew taller than elsewhere. That section was not visible from the main house, not from the barn, not from the overseer's cabin, and which sat northwest of the quarters at an angle that gave it sight lines over the central yard and the main field road, but not the southeast corner. Edmund did not react to this information. He noted it. He came up out of the hole at the end of the day, brushed the clay from his forearms, and walked back with Cyrus and Preacher toward the quarters. Gott was standing at the edge of the central yard, watching them return. His hands were behind his back. The hat brim was at its usual angle. He watched Edmund the way he watched most things, without apparent interest, which was its own kind of interest. Edmund met his eyes for exactly the right duration. Not defiant, not averted. Present, neutral, the look of a man with no interior complexity whatsoever. Galt nodded and walked away. Edmund's pulse had not changed. The second week, but they moved to the northern location. This was more important. The northern boundary well was the harder dig. The soil there had more rock in it, and Callaway wanted it positioned near the timber road, which meant the survey work required Edmund to walk the actual boundary line. With Gott present for the first morning, yes. But Gott had other concerns. The spring planting was beginning in the main fields, which demanded his attention in a way that 3 men digging a well did not. He came in the morning, assessed their progress, issued instructions, and left. And Edmund walked the northern boundary with a shovel in his hands and his eyes open. The timber road was wider than he had expected from what he had glimpsed of it during years of more restricted movement. It ran northwest into a stand of mixed hardwood, oak and sweet gum and water hickory. And based on the angle of the morning light through the canopy, it ran in that direction for some significant distance. He could not follow it. Not now. Not with Cyrus and Preacher present and work to be done. But he could see far enough to understand that the timber road was not a dead end. There was, at the place where the plantation boundary fence met the timber road, a gate. The gate was padlocked. He noted the lock, a heavy iron hasp, the kind used on equipment sheds and grain stores, not the sophisticated pin tumbler mechanisms used on the main house. The kind of lock that responded to force in a particular way, especially if the surrounding hardware was older than the lock itself. He dug. That afternoon, but returning south along the fence line toward the quarters, he walked the fence itself at a pace calibrated to look like the pace of a tired man heading home. He was not tired, or rather, his body was tired and his mind was not, and the mind was managing the body's information more carefully than the body knew. The fence. He had built parts of this fence himself in the second year after his arrival. He remembered specific sections, posts he had set deeper than required because the soil was soft, joints he had reinforced with additional hardware because the wood had been green and he knew it would move as it dried. He knew this fence the way a builder knows what he has built. He knew where it was strong. He knew where it was, under the appearance of strength, actually compromised. The rail that looked solid but had been set in wet clay that had since dried and contracted. The post and brace joint at the southwestern curve that bore more lateral tension than the hardware was rated for. A fence is a text, if you know how to read it. He had written parts of this fence. He could read all of it. What are you thinking right now? Because I need you to sit with what I'm showing you. This man is doing something that most people in his situation, exhausted, surveilled, under the constant threat of violence, most people would never be able to do. He is thinking long. He is thinking with the entire future in mind while performing the present with complete authenticity. Drop a comment. Tell me, what would you do if you were him? If you knew the territory better than your captors? If the map was already in your mind? By the end of April, Edmund had the following information. He had it not in writing. He could write, had been able to write since childhood, but writing anything down in that place would have been a death sentence. And he understood this with the clarity of a man who has seen what happens when such things are discovered. He had it in memory, organized, categorized, indexed with the precision of a man who understood that his mind was the only tool that could not be confiscated. He knew the eastern well's position, landmark. The stand of cottonwood trees beyond the eastern fence was approximately 30 yards deep and opened onto what, based on the alignment of the road he had seen 2 years prior, should be the main county road running northeast toward the river. He could not confirm this without physically being there. But the geometry was consistent. He knew the northern boundary gate, weakness. The padlock was attached to a hasp screwed into a gate post that had been standing for at least 8 years. The wood had been compromised by moisture at the base. The screws holding the hasp were in softened wood. The padlock itself was formidable. The mounting was not. He knew the southeast corner, blind spot. No sight line from any occupied structure or patrol point. Grass that grew higher than elsewhere. Low ground that collected morning mist, which reduced visibility further in the hours before dawn. He knew Galt's patrol rhythm. The eastern fence, dusk. The northern boundary, just after midnight on nights when there had been what Galt considered a behavioral irregularity among the workers during the day, which meant that on normal days, the northern boundary received no patrol between sunset and the early morning watch. On normal days, he knew the dogs, 2, kept in a kennel near the main barn, fed in the evening. Their handler was a white labourer named Pritchard, who was reliable in his habits and unreliable in his sobriety. Pritchard drank with a regularity that Edmund had been tracking, not because he had decided what to do with the information yet, but because information was always worth having. He knew the creek, Mercy Branch. It ran roughly northeast, entering the property near the northern timber road and exiting the southeastern corner. a man moving in water left no scent trail. He had understood this as a theoretical principle for years. He was now thinking about it practically. All of this knowledge had been acquired through work, through the wells, and through the fences, through 4 years of being the man who fixed things, dug things, built things, and was therefore present in places that other people had no reason to be. He had dug their wells. He had built their fences. He had memorized every exit. Now he needed a night. The first close call came on a Thursday in early May. Edmund had, as part of his assigned maintenance work, been sent to check the fence line in the southeastern quadrant, a post that Galt had noticed leaning during his rounds. Edmund went to the post. He examined the post. He also, in the course of examining the post, spent approximately 4 minutes in the southeast corner, the blind spot, measuring by eye the distance to the creek bed, confirming what he had estimated about the visibility issue, and observing a detail he had not had an opportunity to verify before. The far bank of the creek, which he could just see through the tree cover, was firm ground. Not swamp. Not the sucking, ankle-deep mire that characterized much of the bottomland near water in this county. Firm ground, rising slightly, which meant a man crossing the creek would not lose time to terrain. He was standing at the fence, looking through the trees at the creek bank, when he heard footsteps. Not Galt's footsteps. Galt had a particular heel strike pattern. Edmund had catalogued it months ago. These were lighter, quicker. He turned before the sound fully registered and found Cyrus 10 yards behind him, carrying a water bucket. "Post fixed?" Cyrus asked. "Fixing," Edmund said. He turned back to the fence and picked up his tools with the unhurried movement of a man who had been working all along. Cyrus set the bucket down and leaned against a tree, watching. "Long way out here to fix one post." "Post is out here," Edmund said. Cyrus was quiet for a moment. "You looking at the creek?" It was not a question. Edmund tapped the post base with his boot, checking the firmness of the ground. He did not answer immediately. He took the time that the work required. Then he said, "Seeing if water's moving this way?" "Wet spring." Cyrus looked at the creek, looked at Edmund, said nothing more. After a moment, he picked up the bucket and went back the way he had come. Edmund stood at the fence for another minute, tools in hand, allowing his heart rate to return to its working baseline. He had not lied to Cyrus. He had told a truth that contained another truth inside it, the way certain objects contain spaces that are not visible from the outside. May deepened into its second week. The cotton was in the ground. The fields required cultivation. That particular sustained, grinding labor of working the soil between rows to control weeds and aerate the root zone, hour after hour, under a sun that by late morning was already making the air shimmer over the dark earth. Edmund worked the cultivation detail 3 days a week. The other days, he was assigned to maintenance and construction tasks. The overseer's cabin needed new siding on its eastern face, and the tool shed required a new roof over the lean-to section. The lean-to was adjacent to the main barn. The main barn was adjacent to the dog kennel. He paid attention to the dogs. Their names, that he had gathered from listening to Pritchard, were Buck and Mary. Buck was the larger, a brindle hound with a deep carrying voice that triggered easily. Mary was smaller, older, and had the kind of focused intensity that made her, in Edmund's assessment, the more dangerous animal. Buck announced. Mary tracked. If a man were running, and only Buck gave voice, there might be time and distance to work with. If Mary was on the ground, the calculation changed entirely. He watched them, not obtrusively, from the natural vantage points that his work afforded him. He learned their feeding time with precision. He learned which direction they faced when wind came from the north. Important because the path he was beginning to assemble in his mind moved northeast, which meant that on a night with a north wind, he would be moving into a headwind. Which meant the dogs, positioned south of his route, would not catch his scent as easily. He did not record any of this. He did not tell anyone. He lay in the quarters at night in the heat, listening to the breathing of 5 other men, and he reviewed what he knew the way a man reviews a text he is trying to memorize. Not line by line, but in complete conceptual units. The whole map, the whole sequence, the whole logic. Not yet. Not yet. There was something still missing. The second close call was more serious. It was a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of May. Edmund was on the lean-to roof, nailing new cedar shingles in overlapping rows. The work was methodical and visible. He was above the yard level, which meant he could see more of the property than he usually could. And he had noticed this the first day on the roof and had been managing his own gaze carefully ever since. Not looking too long in any direction, not betraying the information gathering that was happening beneath the surface of the labour. He was nailing shingles on the north face of the lean-to when he saw Galt. Galt was standing at the edge of the eastern field, at the fence line, facing east. He was looking at the cottonwood trees. He stood there for a long time, long enough that Edmund, from his elevated position, was able to study him in a way he could not do at ground level. Galt was not surveying the fence. He was looking into the trees. His hand was at his hat brim. He was thinking about something. Edmund drove a nail, looked at the shingle, drove another nail. When he allowed his eyes to move back to the eastern fence line, Galt was gone. He did not know what Galt had been looking at. He did not know what Galt had been thinking. But a man in Edmund's position had to treat uncertainty as risk. Galt standing at the eastern fence meant something. It might mean nothing relevant to Edmund. It might mean everything. He did not have enough information to know. He added it to the inventory. What he didn't know yet, what he couldn't have known, was that Galt had received a letter that week from a colleague in Adams County about a man who had run, 3 weeks prior, from a plantation 40 miles north. The letter described the man as skilled, strategic, someone who had apparently spent considerable time mapping the property. The letter mentioned that the man had worked construction and maintenance, that he had, by all accounts, been a model worker. So Galt was a man who believed in patterns. He had been thinking about patterns. The end of May brought heat of a particular intensity, not the peak summer heat that would arrive in July and August and sit like a physical weight over the land for weeks at a time, but a preview of it, a reminder. The air had a quality that was almost tactile. The soil in the fields held the heat after the sun moved, radiating it upward through the night, so that even the brief darkness offered no real relief. In this heat, Galt began to change his patterns. It was subtle. Edmund would have missed it if he had not been tracking baselines with the precision he had established over months. But the Eastern Fence Patrol, which had been reliably at dusk, a 6 o'clock walk down the fence line, back by 6:30, began to vary. Not every day, not even most days. But twice in the last week of May, Galt walked the eastern section at a different time. Once at mid-afternoon. Once, and this was the one that altered Edmund's breathing when he registered it, after dark. It was not confirmation of anything. It could have been coincidence, routine variation, a response to something unrelated. But it changed the reliability of a variable Edmund had been counting on. This required adjustment. More than adjustment, it required what Edmund understood, in the way he understood engineering, to be a redesign, not a full one. The structure was sound. The sequence was sound. But a flexible component had to replace a fixed assumption. He could not count on the eastern fence being unpatrolled at a specific time. He needed a different route or a different timing mechanism. He spent 3 nights reworking the sequence in his mind. He did not sleep well, but the quarters assumed this was the heat. Subscribe to Unmarked History right now if you have not already, because I need you to understand what this man was doing required a quality of mental discipline that most people in comfortable, safe circumstances never develop. He was holding an entire architectural plan in his mind, in secret, while performing physical labor all day, while managing every expression and word and look, while grieving things we haven't fully talked about yet. Subscribe. I don't want you to miss what comes next. In the first week of June, Galt called Edmund to the yard. This was not unusual in itself. Galt called workers to the yard for various reasons. Task assignments, assessments, the routine bureaucratic operations of plantation management. But the particular way this summons was delivered, through Cyrus, with the instruction that Edmund should come without his tools, which was an unusual specification, created in Edmund a stillness that was different from his ordinary composure. It was the stillness of a man deciding, in real time, what face to show. He showed nothing. He walked to the yard and stood in front of Galt with the neutral presence of a man with no interior life. Galt looked at him for a moment before speaking. This was also unusual. Galt was normally efficient in these interactions. He stated the task and moved to the next thing. The pause was information. "You've been working the fence line?" Galt said. "Yes, sir. North section, east section, the corner repairs." "Yes, sir." "Your work is sound?" Another pause. "I want you on the new grain store foundation this week. West side of the barn." Edmund nodded. "Yes, sir." Galt held the look for another moment. Then he nodded and turned away. Edmund walked back toward the tool shed. He did not look at his hands. He did not change his pace. He was not assigned to the fence line anymore, which meant his reason to be in those locations had been removed. It might have been routine reallocation of labor. It probably was, but it also might have been something else. He could not know. What he knew was that the west side of the barn was 60 yards from the dog kennel, and that Galt, if he was watching something, would now have Edmund in his sight line during the western patrol. The timeline, whatever it had been, had just compressed. It was Cyrus. Not in the way Edmund had feared, not a deliberate betrayal, not a choice made with full understanding of its consequences. But the result was the same. It was a Sunday, the one day when labor slackened into something that was not quite freedom, but was at least its shadow. A few hours in the afternoon when the immediate pressure of supervised work was absent. Edmund was in the quarters, sitting in the doorway, when Cyrus came back from the western field with a changed quality in his body. Something had happened. Edmund could see it in the way Cyrus moved. A tension that was close to the surface. A jaw set at an angle that indicated he was holding something in. He sat down next to Edmund. For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly, facing away, "I got a message." Edmund waited. From across. "From my sister." Cyrus's hands were in his lap. "She's being sold. End of the month. Man from Louisiana." The silence between them was full of specific weight. Edmund said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would help, and he had learned early in his life that certain moments did not require speech. Cyrus said, still quiet, "I heard some men talk once, about moving, about how a person might move." Edmund looked at him. Cyrus met his eyes. "I heard them talking about you. Not recently. Long time ago. Someone who knew you before said you were the kind of man who watches. Edmund's face did not change. People say things. I'm not... Cyrus stopped. Started again. I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give. He looked at his hands. I can't stay here and do nothing. This was the variable Edmund had not accounted for. Not Cyrus specifically, but the thing Cyrus represented. Urgency that did not belong to Edmund's timeline. A person whose need was real and present and would not wait for the conditions to be optimal. The entire structure Edmund had built in his mind was predicated on his own control of timing. One person operating alone, choosing the precise intersection of variables that created the best possibility of success. Two people doubled the risk in ways that were not simply additive. Two people meant one more set of footsteps, one more breathing pattern, one more set of decisions being made in the dark under extreme pressure. Two people meant that Edmund's plan, which was, at its core, and built on the discipline of one man's mind, had to accommodate a second mind that was operating under grief and panic, and the particular desperation of someone watching a deadline approach. He did not say any of this. He looked at Cyrus for a long moment. Then he said, "Give me 3 days." 3 days. He spent them in the kind of focused reconstruction that required every layer of his consciousness operating simultaneously. He reworked the route. He reworked the timing. He assessed Cyrus, not unkindly, but practically, the way a man assesses any factor that affects the structural integrity of a plan. Cyrus was strong, younger than Edmund, capable of sustained physical effort. He was, crucially, frightened enough to follow instructions precisely. That was not nothing. Or a frightened person who trusts you can be more reliable than a confident person who doesn't. He mapped the additional weight against the additional risk. There was one element of the plan that had still been unresolved. The question of what lay beyond the cottonwood trees on the eastern side, how far the path ran, and where it emerged. He had been waiting for an opportunity to confirm this. He had not gotten one. Adding Cyrus to the equation meant he could no longer afford to run an unknown. He needed to confirm the path, which meant he needed one more reason to be at the eastern fence. He manufactured one. On the second day, he reported to Galt that the post-repair in the eastern section had not held, that he had noticed in passing that the settling had continued and the rail was at risk of failing. He said this with the appropriate tone of a man reporting a maintenance issue, nothing more. Galt sent him out. He was given 45 minutes. It was enough. He walked the fence line at his working pace, made his way to the southeast corner, confirmed what he needed to confirm, and was back at the barn before 40 minutes had passed. The path through the cottonwoods ran approximately 30 yards and opened not onto the county road. He'd been wrong about that, but onto a secondary track, a trace road, rutted and narrow, that ran northeast along the edge of a low ridge. He could see from the tree line that the trace road continued for at least a quarter mile before curving out of sight behind the ridge. That was enough. That was more than enough. A trace road was better than a county road. A county road was patrolled. A trace road was used by specific people for specific purposes. Timber workers, small farmers, people who had reason to be there and no reason to pay attention to who else was. A trace road did not have toll crossings or tavern stops where a man might be noticed. He returned to the barn. He found Cyrus in the evening and told him, 2 nights from now, the night of June 14th, 1853. No moon. This was not accident. Edmund had been watching the moon's phase for 6 weeks, noting where in its cycle a given date fell, thinking forward. A new moon meant darkness. Darkness meant the lantern light from any patrol was visible from farther away, which was a disadvantage for the patrol and an advantage for a man who knew to look for it. The heat had broken slightly in the late afternoon. A brief, merciful movement of air from the south that left the night merely warm rather than oppressive. The kind of night where sleeping people slept more deeply than usual because the previous days had accumulated fatigue and the slight relief of the cooler air released it. Edmund had not slept in 2 days. Not from anxiety, though that was present, managed, compartmentalized, but because he had been thinking, reviewing, running the sequence forward in his mind against every variation he could construct, identifying the points where the plan was load-bearing, where it could flex, where it would break. He was ready. At the 3rd hour past midnight, a time he estimated by the position of the stars through the gap in the quarter's roof boards, and a skill he had developed not recently, but over years of being a man who could not afford to not know what time it was. He rose. He had nothing to take. This was deliberate. A man leaving with a bundle was a man who could be identified as leaving. He wore his work clothes. He had, over the previous days, worked something into the soles of his boots. A preparation with a specific purpose that would matter in approximately 90 minutes. He had done this quietly, in stages, in ways that would read as routine maintenance to anyone who noticed. He touched Cyrus's shoulder once. Cyrus was already awake. They did not speak. They had established, during the preparation days, a signal system of gestures for the essential communications: proceed, stop, danger, wait. Edmund used proceed. They moved together toward the door. The quarters were quiet. Preacher's breathing was deep and regular. The others slept. Edmund paused at the threshold and listened to the yard for 30 full seconds. He counted. Not because he felt 30 seconds was precisely the correct amount of time to listen, but because the act of counting controlled the part of his nervous system that wanted to move now, quickly, before the opportunity closed. The yard was still. He stepped out. The first 40 yards were the most dangerous. The open ground between the quarters and the fence line had no cover. If Galt or any patrol was present in the yard or near the main structures, there was no reasonable concealment. The mitigation was timing. This was the deepest part of the night, the hour when human alertness was at its natural nadir, to when the body's chemistry made sustained attention difficult, and the particular quality of the darkness which was substantial. Edmund had also, over the previous 3 days, noted that the lantern hung on the nail at the corner of the barn had developed a habit of going out in the night, because the wick needed trimming and Pritchard had not trimmed it. Tonight, it was out. He moved low, with the particular gait of a man who understood that the human eye detects movement more readily than presence, that the correct technique in low-light open ground was not stillness, but deliberate measured motion that mimicked the movement of something that belonged there. He had practiced this conceptually for years. He executed it now. Cyrus followed, matching his pace, matching his posture. The grief and panic that had been visible in Cyrus 3 days ago had been replaced by something that Edmund recognized. The particular focus that comes when a person has decided absolutely. It was not calm exactly, but it was controllable. They reached the fence line. Edmund did not go over. He went to the specific post, the one in the southeastern corner, the blind spot corner, the one he had built himself, the one whose base hardware he had assessed 3 weeks ago. He worked the lower hinge point of the fence rail with practiced efficiency. No tools, just the specific application of force at the specific angle that the compromised mounting required. The rail swung. Not dramatically, not noisily, just enough for a man to pass through. 12 seconds. He was through. Cyrus was through. He reset the rail behind them. They were in the high grass of the blind spot. The creek, Mercy Branch, was 30 yards southeast. The water was cold. Edmund had expected this and had not warned Cyrus because the cold was not a problem and surprises that were not problems were manageable. Cyrus flinched when he entered the water. A sharp breath, quickly controlled. They moved downstream, northeast, in water that ran between knee and hip deep, current slow but present. Their footsteps made no sound on the creek bottom. They left no scent trail in the water. Edmund was thinking about the dogs. He had prepared for the dogs in the way he had prepared everything else. Not by eliminating the risk, but by managing it. Now, what he had worked into his boot soles over the previous days was a preparation using materials available in the quarters and the work areas. A mixture of substances that, when deposited along a path, would create a false scent trail leading away from the actual route. He had laid a portion of this trail during the fence repair excursion 2 days prior, running it toward the southern fence line, opposite direction from their actual route. If the dogs were released, Buck would likely run south. Mary, the one that worried him, would depend on which scent she picked up first. He had done what he could. He could not do more. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that Pritchard had not drunk that night. For the first time in what seemed like months, the man had gone to his bed sober and slept lightly and was, at this moment, lying awake, listening to the particular silence of the property. They had been in the water for approximately 20 minutes when they heard the dog. Not both dogs. One dog. Buck's voice, that deep carrying bay that Edmund had catalogued, erupting from the direction of the kennel. Once, twice, then silence. They stopped moving. Edmund listened. One dog barking and going quiet could mean anything. A passing animal, a sound in the night that triggered a reflexive response and then settled. Two dogs, sustained, meant pursuit. He waited. Silence. After 60 seconds, he resumed movement, slightly faster than before. The urgency of Cyrus's breathing had changed beside him. The tempo had increased, and Edmund reached out in the darkness and put a hand briefly on Cyrus's arm. The gesture said, "Controlled." It said, "Not yet." They moved. The creek curved. Edmund had anticipated the curve. He had traced the water's flow as best he could from his various observation points, and the northeast turn was consistent with the topography. The curve also, importantly, moved them farther from the sight line of the northern boundary. Within another 10 minutes, they would be past the property line entirely. 10 minutes. The ground began to change under their feet. The creek bottom rose slightly, firmer, less silted. This was the section he had seen from the fence line during the southeast blind spot observation, the far bank rising into firm ground. He directed Cyrus to the bank. They came up out of the water in the tree cover, crouching, listening. The sounds of the plantation were behind them and diminishing. The sounds of the wider night were present. Insects, as if frogs along the water, wind in the upper canopy. Normal night sounds, the kind that stop when something large and purposeful moves through. Edmund held position for 90 seconds, listening to the insects. They did not stop. He stood and moved into the trees. The second obstacle was the trace road. What Edmund had not been able to observe from the fence line, what no amount of calculation from within the property could have told him, was that the trace road, at the point where it curved behind the ridge, ran close to a farmstead. Not a plantation. A small operation, a family farm with a house and a few outbuildings set back 40 yards from the road. There was a dog here too, a farm dog, tied outside. The dog heard them. It did not bark at full voice. It was a farm dog, not a hunting dog, and it started with a lower, a more uncertain sound, the kind a dog makes when it has detected something it is not sure about. In the darkness at 40 yards, they were not visible. They were only smell and sound. Edmund made a decision in approximately 3 seconds. He directed Cyrus off the trace road into the tree line on the northern side. They moved parallel to the road in the trees, footing uncertain in the darkness, branches requiring constant management, pace unavoidably slower. Edmund navigated by the road's presence to his right, keeping it audible, keeping the orientation. The farm dog's noise reached a peak and then faded as they moved past the farmstead's position. They returned to the road. Edmund's left boot had caught a root in the tree line. He could feel that the sole was beginning to separate. He adjusted his gait slightly to manage it. He did not stop. There was no stopping now. Tell me something. Do you think he makes it? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I'm not going to tell you yet. But I want to know what you think, because the next 10 minutes of this story, the next part of what I'm about to tell you, is the part that people who know this history say was the closest run thing of the entire night. They had been moving for 2 hours and 40 minutes when they heard the horses, behind them, on the road, more than one. The sound of multiple horses at pace. Not full gallop, which would have indicated a controlled pursuit, but a moving trot, which meant deliberate search. Lantern light ahead, around a bend behind them, coming toward them. Edmund assessed in less than a second. The trees were 5 feet off the road on the right. He pushed Cyrus into them and followed, moving perpendicular to the road, and then dropping low at approximately 15 feet in, behind a downed oak trunk that was substantial enough to provide concealment. He put his mouth against Cyrus's ear. Face down. Don't move your hands. The horses were getting louder. He pressed himself against the soil behind the oak trunk and thought about breathing, slow, through the nose, his face against the ground, the particular smell of the earth, decaying leaf matter, moisture, the presence of the wood's slow dissolution. He thought about nothing outside of that breathing. Control everything you can control. Give nothing to chance that doesn't have to be chance. The horses passed. 2 riders. He could see, from the gap between the oak trunk and the ground, the lantern light move past. He could hear voices, words he could not fully distinguish, but the tone of men conducting a search, calling to each other, moving with the particular organized urgency of pursuit. He waited until the sound of hooves had been gone for 2 full minutes. Then he waited 2 minutes more. Then he rose. Cyrus's face, when Edmund could see it in the darkness, was the face of a man who has just understood completely and viscerally the reality of what he is part of. Not fear exactly. Something further along than fear. The clarity that comes on the other side of it. Edmund touched his shoulder. Proceed. They went back to the road and moved northeast at the fastest pace that silence permitted. By the time the sky began to change, that first, nearly imperceptible lightning in the east that precedes the suggestion of dawn by a full hour. They had been moving for nearly 4 hours. Edmund could see the ridge that he had identified weeks ago as the topographical marker for a road junction 3 miles northeast of the Callaway property. He had extracted this information from a conversation between 2 white labourers on a supply detail 6 months prior. He had not known at the time that he would need it. He had stored it anyway. At the road junction, there was a waypoint, not a safe house, not in the formalized sense that would later be described in the accounts of organized resistance networks. but a contact. A man whose profession required him to move between communities, whose wagon was regularly on these roads without attracting suspicion, and who had, Edmund had reason to believe, carried people before. The belief was based on a single comment made obliquely 18 months ago by a woman on a neighbouring property whom Edmund had encountered once during a joint work detail. She had said, in reference to a man she described as the farrier, that he was a man who did not count the people in his wagon. Edmund had not known what that meant with certainty. He had been fairly confident he understood it. He was about to find out if he was right. They reached the junction as the sky moved from black to the deep grey that precedes colour. A wagon was there. The man sitting on the bench had the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting without appearing to wait, looking at the road ahead, reins loose in his hands, and as if he had simply stopped for the ordinary reason of resting his horse. He did not look at them directly when they approached. He said to the road ahead of him, "Storage is in the back. Covers on the left side. Be still." Edmund and Cyrus moved to the wagon bed and settled under the covers. The wagon began to move. Edmund lay in the dark of the wagon bed and felt the road moving under him. The particular rhythm of wheels on uneven ground, the creak of the axle, the sound of the horse's hooves on dirt. He could feel Cyrus's breathing beside him, still faster than normal, but slowing. Still alive. Still present. Still here. He thought about Preacher back at the quarters, who had taught him the topography of this county over the course of 4 years of small, careful conversations. He thought about his mother, who had told him, years ago in a place whose name he kept inside himself, that the world communicated in patterns. He thought about the fence. He had built that fence. He had built it to last. Properly set posts, correctly jointed rails, hardware rated for the load. He had built it well because he built things well, because that was how he was. And the irony of it, the thing he had understood for a long time without putting it into words, was that the quality of his work had been the quality of his invisibility. They had not watched him closely because he was reliable. They had not watched the fence closely because he had built it honestly. And in that reliability, in that honesty, he had concealed the one thing they never thought to look for. He had built their cage and memorized its dimensions and then walked through it. The outcome of Edmund's escape from Calloway's plantation in June of 1853 was not formally recorded. Most outcomes like his were not. The machinery of the state was oriented toward recapture, not documentation, and many of the men and women who successfully moved through that machinery left behind only the silence of their absence. A name in a ledger with no subsequent notation. A record that ends where the person began to live again. What we know about men like Edmund is not what the records say. It is what the records do not say. The silence at the end of the ledger entry. The blank space where a sale or a death notice should be, and isn't. The missing. Edmund was among the missing. Cyrus was among the missing. And they were 2 more of the countless thousands whose names appear in the institutional records of American slavery, right up to the point where the institution lost track of them, and then do not appear again, because they had moved into a life that did not require the institution's permission, and the institution, for all its power, could not follow them everywhere. Mercy Branch still runs through that corner of Mississippi. The property it once bounded is long gone. The house, the quarters, the barns, the fences. The land itself has gone through 100 cycles of ownership and use and loss since 1853. The cottonwood trees are different trees now, or perhaps there are no cottonwood trees at all. But the creek runs. And in the particular way that certain places hold the memory of what moved through them, in the way water holds temperature long after the sun has moved, in the way old ground holds the shape of what once stood on it. There is something in that corner of bottomland that has not entirely released what happened there. A man who knew the shape of his cage. A man who built their walls and memorized their gates. A man who, on a night with no moon in June of 1853, walked through the fence he had built himself and did not look back. He had dug their wells. He had built their fences. And when the time came, he had used every stone and post and waterway he had ever touched as a step toward the only destination that had ever mattered. He knew every exit. He took one. The names in this story have been simplified or constructed to protect the privacy of descendants in accordance with the complexity of historical record keeping during this period. The events described draw from documented patterns of resistance, escape, and survival during the antebellum period in the American South. That is unmarked history. If this story reached you, if you felt Edmund's patience, if you felt the weight of what he carried and the precision of how he carried it, then share this. Put it in front of someone who needs to hear it. These are not just stories. These are records of a particular kind of human intelligence, operating under conditions designed specifically to make that intelligence invisible. Subscribe, ring the bell, leave a comment. Tell me where you are in the world, and tell me which part of this story you are still thinking about. Because there are more where this came from. There are always more. Unmarked history. The stories they didn't put in the books,